Yeah.
Jibba jabba.
Yes, we're rolling the jibber jabber. Kiran, Shekhar, Kiran.
Hi.
Good to meet you.
You too.
So now I'm going to pretend like we just started the podcast and say, hi, Kiran, Shekhar, welcome welcome to. Hi, Kiran, Shekhar, welcome to The Curious Case of with Ira Khan. Thank you so much for being on this podcast and for agreeing to come and chat with me about this extremely complicated yet interesting topic of parenting in the digital age and just parenting with, this new complication of the virtual world. Shekhar's been working in the space of child and adolescent mental health for more than 40 years. Very cool person. Drafted the thing that eventually became the POSCO Act.
The law, yeah.
Yeah, the law. Kiran is many things, but also a parent. And so, and her child just turned 13. So,
I have
Already?
entered the teenage years.
I was shook though. I was like 13 already. But anyway, that's going to be fun. But yeah, so before we started, wanted to sort of just discuss what the digital world means, because there's Instagram, but then there's also gaming, which now happens socially. So it's not like I'm playing video games. I'm playing video games with a bunch of people across the world. I'm creating my avatar and all of those other things, which I guess would come into self-expression and things like that. So just, for us to sort of talk about what we mean by the digital world before we get into the whole, how to navigate it. And, also things like, I'm honestly not entirely sure how to bring it up in the formalized conversation, but I know that the brain makes things real. So, for example, I'm watching a movie and something makes me sad, but I'm actually crying, right? So even if it's a make-believe thing, I have real feelings about it. And so then it may be a comment on Instagram or something like that, or character might, I don't know, die. Or my friend on the internet might stab me on the back. But it has a real world emotional effect on me. And just sort of how all of this will, affect a child growing up developmentally, maybe to a certain degree, but also then their perception of it, which is not so much neurological, but more meta, I guess. And the other thing I found out is that please correct me if I'm wrong, until the age of 6, you don't really know the difference between reality and imagination. So somewhere along that line, you start to be able to tell that there is something that is imaginary and there is something that is real. And until a certain age, you don't know that there are two different things.
I don't want to get into the technical issue of child development, but yes, in terms of object permanency and so on, if you look at traditional theories of child development, particularly the work of Jean Piaget, who wrote his theory after observing his own children in play. For a child, for example, if you don't see an object, it doesn't exist. You may actually hide it in front of the child, but if you do not see it, it doesn't exist. But you reach a certain stage where object permanency takes place and it's got to be somewhere and you start hunting for it. And those logical processes started about that age. So yes, there are those kind of stages.
And I'm wondering if there's been any study on how neurologically the advent and like the complete like sort of I don't know, the envelopment of the digital world on a child's brain has actually maybe in some ways affected them neurologically also? Has it changed in terms of like sort of hormonal changes, in terms of how kids, say, developmental stages have changed perhaps over time?
Kiran, I'm sure they have. The reason I'm stating this is because if you look at it evolutionary, from an evolutionary lens, several million years ago, because language had not developed, the structure of the brain was very different. Those parts of the brain, which technically are called the rhinencephalon, which is basically your sense of smell and so on, because to survive, you needed those senses. But as language developed, that's why the frontal lobe is so big. And people are now wondering, with language shifting to this funny SMS language and the digital world, whether changes are going to occur in the structure of how the brain functions. And a lot of people working in cognitive neuroscience are actually doing this kind of research work.
I almost like, because we're talking about video games, I once was watching, when Azad was quite a bit younger, was watching him play a Minecraft game called Bed Wars. And he must have been about, whatever, 8 or 9. And I don't know if you're familiar with Minecraft. I certainly didn't. I've seen it, but I've never played it. And I was watching him play, and honestly, because everything is in cubes and pixels, basically, the whole world is made. It's the most unnatural way you can actually look at an object or a human, because in nature there are no blocks. There's no actual cube, in a sense. I mean, crystal structure might be close to it, but in a larger object sense, you'd never see it. So for my eye to even perceive that this, and he was like, there was something really hectic going on. There was this guy running across a gangplank and diving onto something and breaking a bed, and I could not tell the character apart from the landscape. Like my eye couldn't even actually make sense of it. But for him, it was completely seamless. He knew. He was like, "What are you talking about, Mama? That he's there. I mean, like that he's doing this, and this is a flower, and this is a piece of meat." And I'm like, "No, it's not. It's a whole bunch of colored cubes and squares and pixels." So I feel like even the way, visual, of course, perception must have adjusted to kind of make sense of, gameplay. Is I mean, something that definitely there's a shift. I mean, of course, we all adjust to it. We've all adjusted to cinema over 100 years to now arrive at like the fastest kind of games. Azad's now playing a game called Valorant, which an adult gaming friend of mine said, "I'm too old for it. I can't play it anymore. Like, it's just too fast.
Too fast.
It's just too fast. You need this fast twitch kind of, you need speed for it." Yeah, it's crazy.
There is a generic thing about children and play. The object that they play with and the complexity of its development is another issue. Very simply stated, I mean, I believe that children are natural born philosophers and scientists because they have the gift of curiosity and wonder. For a child, even a discarded toffee wrapper is a plaything, because it has texture and you can hear it and it takes flight, when you. So any object that a young child finds, the child will look at it and then sort of and then feel it and see whether it makes not and even lick it. Don't lick it, but the child is a scientist. He's experimenting to see what the thing tastes like. It's a natural gift that that three processes systematically destroy. They are called parenting, education, and growing up. But levity apart, as the complexity of playthings increase, the basic proclivity of a child, as they say, birds fly, fish swim, and children play. It's as simple as that. And they exercise a certain native intelligence which is inborn. Children, do respond to what is available to them. And availability depends on age, it depends on resources, which section of society, I guess, you come from, and what kind of resources a family can provide to a child. And they play and they experiment, often successfully and often in complex ways.
Yeah.
Okay, so from what I'm getting, I think we can sort of look at when we say kids, let's say like 10 onwards ish, closer to teenagehood and preteens. Because I'm sure, it'll be very different when you're talking about giving an iPad to a 3-year-old. So please bring that up whenever relevant and you think it needs to be there. But I think let's talk about, I don't even know whether, social media, but also like gaming and what in your mind is the digital world? Like, can you tell me, and then can you tell me in your mind what it means?
I have to, of course, preface this by saying I have experience of only one child, and every child is so different. And I have a son, and I'm sure boys and girls can have fairly different stages at which they do things or different things that they're interested in. But from my experience, the I think the idea of a screen or what is any sort of digital interface that they use today, we have to think of a little more like just a tool, a bit like how we used to use a pen. I don't feel so much that it's they use the digital media in different ways. It's not only being a kind of a consumer, but it's also having some sort of in sort of agency around it as well. And so, we can break that down a little bit more. Different kids are very different. They are allowed screens at different stages, and I think that makes a rather big difference. But it's not, like you said earlier, it's not all about how screens kind of can completely consume them and destroy them, but it's also about what they're getting emotionally, cognitively from the different media that they are using, which I think is of greater interest. And given that now it's even as adults, our lives are completely taken over by various kinds of sort of digital media. I think, it begs the question of like, if we can't give it up and our lives and the world is largely run by it, then how do we kind of make children who are digital natives actually and who are much better at anything digital than we are, how do we make them aware again of how much their behavior is being controlled or sort of manipulated by what they use. We ourselves are not aware of it, and we talk about doom scrolling and things like that, but it's kind of, now I've reached a stage where the panic about it, as any parent has when their children first migrate to screens, that panic is a little bit now replaced by curiosity and interest, because I also see how much he can learn from the things that he watches and the games that he plays, and how much actually it is developing them in ways perhaps that traditional forms of education or media can't. For instance, he's teaching himself languages, he's teaching himself guitar, he's doing a bunch of things with these tools, digital tools, which are far more efficacious than, say, going to a class, but they're not the same as having a human interaction. So there are all kinds of sort of facets to this new digital personality, and how they're going to how they use it to kind of navigate the world in some ways.
Actually, when we were talking earlier, one of the things that Kiran had brought up, which I didn't realize, is that she was talking about how when kids would come home from school or from play, they would come to their rooms, and then essentially you knew that they were safe because they were at home. But now they're in their homes, but online, and therefore not really at home. And if I could ask Kiran for you to, you talked about how about a year or so ago the panic sort of calmed down as you spoke to other adults who game and things like that. But just for our audiences, there are lots of parents who stress about this and they don't necessarily know what to do. Technology is developing so quickly that forget the kids, even we have to catch up and we have to understand how it works, right? So as a parent, can you just tell us some of the worries that were going on in your head?
Mm-hmm. Just to clarify, the panic hasn't gone anywhere. It's just now at a lower level. I feel like I need to equip myself with knowledge and understanding and actually experience some of the things that Azad does himself personally, so that I just have more knowledge, and it helps me sort of also understand what he's responding to. And I think it also helps me develop an understanding of what's going on in the outside world, because I do feel like fossilized sometimes when I am confronted with the things that he does. But I think the worry for me, especially when after COVID there was this huge migration to devices even for learning, was how safe are our kids, or how safe is my kid online? Because they're pretty much using it unsupervised as much as when they're younger, roughly kind of the apps or the platforms they're using. But as it sort of progressively gets more complicated, you do not have very much even of an idea what they're doing on these games and what is possible on these games. That kind of led me down a little bit of a rabbit hole to understand safety on the internet. And I was trying to put together some resources for myself and other parents like me. I haven't yet fully done it, but I've realized there are lots out there for us to kind of make sense of what is possible for a, say, 7, 8, 9-year-old who's unsupervised on the internet. What could happen? And it's actually can be extremely frightening. Because honestly, big tech does not have provisions in place at the level that we would like them to have when it comes to children's access inadvertently even to sites that they should not be accessing. I think there's a great need for us to make it very simply the way we did when, for the good touch, bad touch kind of thing, when we did for the physical world for, to prevent child sex abuse. Similarly, to create something very simple that the youngest kids can understand about how not to give their personal information to anyone, how to talk to an adult when someone on the internet asks you for something, how to be able to tell children who are very young that what you see as another human being on the internet could potentially not be another kid, could be a much older person masquerading as a child, about grooming, about all the various scary things that you read about and we know still continues. I did have those conversations with Azad. I feel like his school was very, very mindful of all these things when getting children onto devices. They had device policies. They had kids understand what they could and couldn't do online. And that really helped calm sort of a bunch of my anxieties. But every stage, it's a new stage, and I'm learning much slower than he is. So I think as a parent, my worry still is now that he is, in that much broader space of perhaps playing with unknown people on these games. Slowly will perhaps get onto various kinds of social media like Instagram, etc. I'm sort of trying to figure out how to not, sort of be a helicopter parent, and how to give him the tools to navigate this mindfully and carefully himself. There's apps that do that for you now, like Custodio, and things that kind of tell you how much time your kid has spent on what platform online. And I kind of have used this app in collaboration with Azad, because I was like, look, this is for you and me to see how much time, because often, just like me, I think that I'm just on Instagram for half an hour and 2 hours have passed by. Similarly for him, he's in a mad virtual world, and doesn't know how much time he spent. So these are, I think, the worries now about, what he can do, what the sort of dangers are of that behavior. Honestly, he was on Reddit, on Discord, all these things well before I even knew what they were. So there is that fear that there is, I don't know, there's potential for people to, I don't know, harm him virtually, draw him into some sort of space which is negative or could be quite frightening. So those are things that I'm teaching myself about also, so that I can walk with him on that path.
Yeah, the safety issue that you speak about has of course been looked at from a very systemic perspective, both by METI, which is the Ministry of Electronic Information Technology and so on, as well as the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights. And having been on their committee to look at the whole issue of online safety, particularly when you refer to the processes of grooming, and that too grooming that can occur in a child who is vulnerable because the nature of his or her relationship with the primary caretakers itself is not great. And then you gravitate towards people who you feel are affirming of who you are. I actually wanted to go back to the whole issue of online safety and this business of in the whole experience and activity of parenting. Instead of placing checks and controls, how do you convert it into a relationship mode? And I'm kind of reminded of a scene in this very famous Hollywood blockbuster called Ben-Hur. When Judah Ben-Hur is getting very powerful, Stephen Boyd, who played Messala, asked someone, how do you fight an idea? And he says, you fight an idea with another idea. So if there are ideas in the dark web and in all the other sites which have the potential of jeopardizing children's safeties, both in terms of online predators as well as content that is inappropriate to the age of the child. And if you gather what ideas they're generating from what they see without getting into this panic judgment mode. Because the moment you get into control and judgment, what you're ensuring is they'll never speak to you again.
Correct.
So if you want to create ideas that nuance whatever inappropriate content they're accessing, it's very important to keep that in mind. The what if I were to do this, or what would happen if I did this? And it's that kind of discussion around children's exposure and experience of the digital world, particularly where inappropriate content or excessive content or dark content is concerned, to be able to put a frame of reference on understanding issues, particularly where, let's say, sexuality is concerned. A final word on this. I'm often, fond of saying I have a sexually transmitted disease. It's called life. But levity apart, what is the relationship? Issues of health of consent, of permission, of safety, of privacy, of boundaries. These are all the subjects that come into discussion without either dissing or trashing or trivializing intimacy and love and relationships, which are beautiful parts of human experience. So how do you imbue it with that, the kind of joyousness that indeed it should be, rather than creating the whole sense of shame, secrecy, and stigma around the whole thing, and then shutting down conversations? So that's the way that one would navigate the kind of issue, Ira, that you have spoken about.
And so I sort of wanted to understand from you, Kiran, in terms of what you have tried. Because like you just said, you talk to Azad about it. You make it an explicit conversation. In your experience, does it ever get awkward? How does he respond to that conversation? Because sometimes when you're 13 and your parents try and talk to you about something, you're just like, eh. And so I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how those conversations happen. Does he like shook them off?
Yeah, well, I have noticed the change also now that he's kind of a teenager. There is much less interest in communicating. There's that monosyllabic stage has begun. We're like, yeah, it was okay, it was fine, and you have to kind of nudge
Probe.
things out. And I genuinely believe that children have their boundaries. They need their privacy. I'm really mindful of not walking into his room any old time, and kind of making sure that we have an open channel of communication where he can feel that he can talk to me at any time, and still, of course, making sure he knows that I am the adult and I am responsible for him and his safety. And beyond a point, while we are indeed really good friends, I'm still his mother. And I think that we tend not to be able to differentiate. We're very prescriptive sometimes, like you have to do this or have to do that, and the conversation is left out, or we're just pleading with them and we become negotiators. And walking the line between the two is something that I have learned to do. Some things are genuinely, I know they're just better for him, and I would rather he do them. And I think he appreciates that someone is taking care of that for him. But I think importantly that the conversations are, they're interesting, they're more fun. And I genuinely believe that just saying, so how was your day, will not like elicit a long essay type answer. But, making sure that you have that one meal together, whether it's dinner or breakfast, even if it's not that much conversation, doing something together tends to make the conversation a little more natural rather than a forced kind of interrogation of the child. It's also, I feel it's nice to kind of, at least for me, to understand what he does and what he's interested in by kind of getting into those things. And I feel it gives me some sort of a picture of him at this stage of life. So whether it's explain to me what's happening in JJK, and then I'll get like a 45-minute answer about like, this is what happened in the finale of Jujutsu Kaisen, or this is how volleyball is suddenly he's obsessed with volleyball, and what are the rules of volleyball, and then he can talk for 20 minutes. So I think it's I'm interested in him. I think that helps. I'm genuinely super interested in him. I feel like he's a really empathetic, wonderful kid. I learn from him and I enjoy my time with him. And to me, he's a gift. I enjoy him. So it's not work. At the same time, I have to be mindful that, boss, there are pitfalls and I have to be aware of them myself. So I'm constantly, for instance, this app to kind of keep track of
Right.
what he spends time on online. You can upgrade and know exactly what websites he goes to. And I feel like he's entitled to his privacy, so long as I've equipped him with information. I've kind of explained to him the dangers that he could encounter. I think I'd like him to be able to make certain decisions. I think what's also really important, taking off from what Shekhar said, is that this is an era of, not an era, but this is the stage in his life of exploration. This is when, again, of course, no judgment and none of that, but also the freedom to, understand his body, his mind, but not like you can be quite bewildered by it if you don't have a context. So a couple of years ago, we did a kind of a workshop for kids around 10, 11. There are people who do it, who conduct it professionally, who can do the birds and the bees talk, but in a fun and still informative way, which is not awkward when parents do it. Like it's not easy for us to talk about, oh, your bodies are going to change, this is going to happen to you, lots of things that could be frightening, but it's a wonderful new sort of stage of your life. And so these kind of workshops, I feel, really help. And I was introduced to one of them through a friend, and now the school did it. I introduced the school to it, so the whole grade, 2-3 grades of them did it. And it's fun it's funny also because they'll talk about things that are obviously uncomfortable, especially if you're doing it with both boys and girls.
And your
so it's also normalizes it, that our skin is going to change, our bodies are going to change. We'll have,
Acne.
yeah, acne. That's the enduring. That's what they hate the most, actually, out of all of it. But yeah, so it's. I think as parents, it's also important to kind of know that and acknowledge that we don't know everything. We are going to be learning as we hit each stage with our kids. At the same time, it's our job to kind of understand what they could encounter and prepare them for it.
Now, the balance between the role as a parent and the role as someone who's also sort of growing with your child. And I think particularly in adolescence, if they see in the relationship and in the semantic and the dialectic of the communication that you come from a mode of authenticity and not from an interrogative or a suspicious or a mode of concern, but more in terms of authenticity and deep interest, then the response is automatically. Now, this doesn't come naturally because these are not taught. Also, Ira, there is a certain assumption that people make about children and childhood. I'm not even talking about adolescents. Why do adults assume, for example, when you speak to 2-year or 3-year-olds, that you should lisp? Hello, BT, that kind of stuff, and then chucking the excuse me, who gave you the right to chuck, because it's a boundary violation. You didn't take permission. So I have this 2-year-old friend of mine, and I was in his father's party, and one of these friends of father, hello, BT, kaise ho? Didn't wait for the answer. This kid turns around to me and says, he calls me Sheku. He says, Sheku, why he talk like that? Yesterday he talk okay.
Yeah.
So, if you fake it, kids make out. They are very astute in spotting fakes. And
So since we're talking about preteens and we're talking about conversation, we're not necessarily good at talking about sexuality even before the digital world came into being. So this whole transitional period and having these conversations is already something that we struggle with. But all parents love their kids and are worried about them, right? And they would, and I think what you talked about in terms of process or exposure, the idea is that if the parents or someone who loves you exposes you to these things, they do it with a sensitivity, they do it with your safety in mind, versus the internet, which is a tool and has all the information out there, but doesn't particularly care how old you are and whether you are receiving that information in a way where you are able to process it, where you are able to have a conversation about it, where you're able to feel safe as you discover that new aspect of your life or whatever it is, right? And so we may have not been great at having those conversations before, but I feel like we're kind of getting to a point where you don't have a choice anymore, because your kid is going to find out about all of these things and the whole world and all of that. And you can either be part of that conversation and then sort of guide how they get exposed to it, how quickly, what they learn about it, or not, and they'll still find out about it. And so this is where the communication bit conversational bit comes in, where you talk about, instead of looking at it from obedience, can we make it a conversation? And the idea of, yes, we're all learning, right? And you will make mistakes and you need to be authentic. So how can one be a good enough parent?
No, there's a little more to this point, Ira. Conversations is one thing. Whether it is the digital world or whether it is so-called sexuality education, the problem is when you reduce sexuality to reproductive biology and further reduce reproductive biology to the penetration ejaculation paradigm, it's a very reductionist approach. What happens with the digital world, particularly with pornography, is that it reduces sexuality to certain very core aspects of sexual intimacy. But sexuality is a much larger frame of experience, a much larger paradigm. It's about relationships, it's about emotions, commitment, aesthetics, communication. The physical aspects of it are personal and private. Two individuals or one individual in his or her own career of initiation and experience of sexuality is unique. And people have their own scripts and their own experience and what they like and what they don't, and what works for them, what turns them on and what doesn't. So it doesn't matter whether you're 16 or whether you're 60. The same parameters for this education hold. The frame of reference for sexuality is it happy, healthy, safe, and responsible? Happy, healthy, safe, and responsible. Which is why when I alluded to earlier of the kind of approach that we take to the content of the conversation doesn't start with how to do it. The conversation starts with relationships. We talk about different kinds of relationships, about emotions within relationships, about what intimacy is, how does intimacy manifest. Now, intimacy itself ranges from human intimacy, an act of great kindness, someone who's hurt and you assist the person, your clothes get soiled. That's human intimacy. And there is aesthetic intimacy when you share a cultural platform and you're watching a film at the interval and you say, no, but did you watch that earlier film? And then there is relational intimacy of two people who are working in the same office. And then there is affectional intimacy. Not all people that you work with in an office do you necessarily have affection towards. And then, of course, there is romantic intimacy, and then there is sexual intimacy. So the discussion, the conversation, core aspects of sexuality come somewhere towards the end of
So actually, I don't
conversation.
necessarily mean sexuality. I just mean any concept that you get exposed to as a child. A lot of times we talk about sexuality and sex because, I don't know, I guess we're most afraid of it or most ashamed of it. And I don't want to necessarily get into suicide here right now, but also there is a lot of talk about younger, the age of people who are now dying by suicide is getting kind of really low. And the reason I brought up the whole imagination versus reality bit in the beginning is because if I'm 6 years old, I don't necessarily know the difference between what is real and what is imaginary. So, how can I possibly want to die? I don't think that is what is going on in their heads, right? So, what's happening is that kids now have access to the entire plethora of information that is out there in the world through the internet, whether it is about sex or porn or what is sugar's bad for you, whatever, anything that they're learning, they have access to because of the internet, right? If I'm a parent and I'm with you as you learn about this, I can safeguard you from the thing that is maybe incorrect or unhelpful as information. I can explain it to you because I'm not a 3-second video that's going to get over and then leave you with that. Right? I can talk to you about it. You can ask me a question. And then that'll affect how I absorb that information.
I feel what's kind of important for us to do, since you brought that up, is there's a sense that, I mean, as children grow, of course, their understanding of what they see as real, the pressures on them, depending on what they are encountering at that stage, change. I think what's important for us as society to do is to accept, of course, that beyond a point, we cannot control the experiences that they're going to have online. What we have to do is equip them with a sense of security and a sense of self that's strong enough to navigate the challenges that come their way. In that sense, being digitally literate is very important to understand what is fake and what is real, to apply certain a sort of a methodology anytime you see anything online, to check its veracity, to check whether you're being manipulated in any way politically, also to know that the internet or social media is designed in some way with a very capitalist kind of framework of consumption, consuming a way of being, a way of looking, a way like the way that you should be earning, the kind of lifestyle you should have. Many, many kinds of things are just baked into some of these apps that these children are going to use. So how do you equip them to know that, listen, this is also part of a larger, I don't know, military industrial kind of complex, and you're a pawn you have to be aware of that to some extent. So you to have that sense of distance, I think from when you're younger, is to kind of like have those conversations. And even in school, Azad did a whole digital literacy program where they kind of told them about AI, about how things are manipulated, how much you need to check for facts and what's factually correct and things like that. But so I feel this is it, we cannot micromanage them, but teaching kids how to think for themselves, how to sort of be able to separate the chaff from the grain is our job, because then they'll be able to apply it at any stage of their lives. And those pressures that they encounter, which will be different at different stages, they should kind of have some, they should be equipped to handle.
The moment those alternative possibilities are presented not as an instruction or as an imperative,
Yeah.
but as possible ways of rethinking or analyzing something in a different way, in its myriad different possibilities, gives them a wider frame of reference, so that it doesn't get circumscribed into what the digital stuff is. Because what happens with the digital stuff is there is no iteration. You're watching.
Exactly.
There is no one to process
Exactly.
how you're responding to it, except what the kid is thinking internally in his or her mind. But the moment as a parent you come in, not with any judgment or instruction or order to put it down, you're spending too much that's the common response, too much of time, put it down, better things to do, as opposed to coming with a sense of wonderment, of surprise, of curiosity, of keen interest, It makes a lot of difference.
No, so I think because a big part of the show is, there are all these things. What can I do about them? I just want to articulately put it out there, because in the beginning you talked about play, right? And you talked about curiosity, and then you just talked about putting it in past, imperfect past tense and future tense in terms of questioning it, like what if and how about, versus saying this game says PG-13, until you hit 13 you can't play this game, which would be prescriptive. Whereas how do I turn it? Because I've been taught prescriptive, right? We've all been taught prescriptive. And now here we are telling people don't be prescriptive. How do we not be prescriptive? And I think what I'm getting from you guys is, if you take it from a place of, I'm interested in what is going on in your life. I'm not checking on you because I want to know how long you've played for. You could have played for 3 hours, you could have played for 15 minutes. I'm asking about the game because I want to know about the game. I'm coming in to check on you, not to be like, hey, have you finished your screen time? But I'm coming in to check with you, being like, what happened in this part of the game, so that it becomes conversation. They actually want to respond to you. And then talking about AI or all of those things, instead of coming from a place of, here, these are the things that could be bad for you, just be like, oh, these are all the things that are there in the world. Let's get to know about all of them. And then sort of leave their minds to make give them some agency to be like, oh, this doesn't seem like it's the best thing to do.
I think I really feel like over the last, I don't know, ever since technology has developed at this incredibly rapid speed, machines are sort of reprogramming us. We are not programming them as much. We are now in some ways slaves to the machine. And I think in order to break that loop, it needs us to also engage with machines slightly differently as adults. What I feel is that all of this technology has been developed by people who want us to be on our machines. It's developed by massive amounts of money and thinking and genius to keep you there in front of, how do I not let that person get off the app, is the thinking, right? So, we are letting kids who are 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 be manipulated by massive technological marvels, which are designed to make you a vegetable in front of that screen, right? So how do you beat that and not fall prey to this consumerist kind of behavior where you're just consuming this whatever that thing is giving you, either in terms of a film or visual content, or it's a game that just you supposedly just whatever, put tiles on top of each other, or you're even Minecraft, which is in the creator mode, supposed to be highly creative. You can really create worlds, which is why it was so successful. After a point is designed, of course, to exercise your creativity, but you don't want to get out of that world, right? I think the only way to beat it, and this was something interesting that I heard recently, some Instagram reel or something, where this neuroscientist was talking about how anxiety and creativity are linked. And she was saying that they kind of studied, they're kind of on sides of the brain in which, like, when you're anxious, it's really hard for you to do something creative, which is to make anything of any kind. And so they tried to study whether by making, anxiety reduces. And they did find that there was a correlation between creativity and anxiety. And it was actually in the context of anxiety, in talking about how just making, it could be making a sandwich. It doesn't mean that you have to necessarily go out and start sculpting or something, but engaging in a creative act reduces that sense of anxiety. And we all know how the digital world has in some way created a low-lying sense of feeling a bit breathless, not being able to keep up with all the changes that are going on around you in the world. What it's also done is bring the world into your life too much. At a fractal speed, we have information coming at us from around the world, which would filter through various modes of, communication to us months later, maybe say 100 years ago. So, how do we deal with these vast quantities of information? And I would argue there are only a couple of ways that we can deal with it, and that's because there's something incredibly amazing about the natural world. There's something unique about being human, and these are the two things that we need to reclaim: being human and the
Nature.
natural world around us. And in that sense, if we get into a creative kind of frame of mind, even when we get onto the internet. For instance, Azad used to tell me, and I used to ask him, "What are you doing on YouTube?" And he used to always, because we had the same account, I would see that he would always be on, kind of things that these maker accounts where people are making things. They're making random things like out of cardboard, and there's some guy who's created like a dinosaur out of cake, and these kinds of things. But he like Shekhar was saying, they're interested in the most interesting odd things, like how do you take a bunch of bottles and make an instrument
Right.
or whatever. And I think there is a whole world of internet activity out there that we could perhaps encourage our children towards, which is creative, A, and B, ourselves in the real world, do more creative things with them. And I think there's no way to replicate what humans do when we work collaboratively, when we work together. There's a joy in being part of a tribe, being part of a community that I don't think, I mean, of course, gamers love their gaming community online, but I'm sure there's a massive high when you all get together in a room and you're discussing the game, or even online. There is a sense of community. So I feel like those are the two things, like I feel that
To hold on
we
to.
need to, encourage and it definitely will reduce anxiety, reduce the sense that you are you're on the receiving end and you're just consuming. You need to have a little bit of agency in this world, and feel yourself rather than, just a consumer. Feel like a human.
Because I think we've talked about, it's a tool, it's there to stay. How do we navigate it? Let's navigate it through curiosity, conversation. Let's hold on to what keeps us human as we go through this. Take more interest in our kids. There's just that worry of addiction, or of, even if it's not addiction, kind of just like manipulation, right? There's that line that we're worried about. And if you would say, if you could give us a few ways to safeguard from that, because it's a spectrum, and like you said, you observe, but you don't helicopter parent. And you come in when you need to, you give them their
Intervene only.
space. Yeah.
Professional bodies recommended that for preschoolers, the total amount of screen time should be about 90 minutes a day, and that too not continuously, but in 4 or 5 bursts of 15 to 20 minutes each. And for kids who are a little older, 7, 8, 9, 10, it could be about 2, 3, 4 hours a day. And the 11, 12-year-olds, 4, 5 hours, and for your 16, 17, 18-year-olds, perhaps 6 to 7 hours, 8 hours a day. Particularly if you add online education to it, to the whole math. That's one part of the story. But then a couple of years ago, the mental health fraternity came up with this construct of behavioral addictions, of which internet gaming disorder, as it's called, but also the preoccupation with with emailing, the internet, social media, texting, sexting, pornography, and all the panic and concern, Kiran, that you alluded to, also sort of came to fore. Now, there's a difference between, let's say, a 16-year-old who's spending 18 hours a day on either gaming or other forms of engagement with social media or the digital world, now shifting into avatars and virtual identity and metaverse and all of that, at the expense of social interactions, uh, at the expense of affectation and biological functions in relationships, leading to discussions, control issues, argumentation, raised voices, violence, and so on. Now, there we are dealing with a spectrum of manifestation which is problematic. And then there is a developmental perspective to this, and I want to go back to the whole learning issue that Kiran has alluded to, that there's a whole lot of learning potential. Kids are learning stuff that they may otherwise not have opportunities for whatever reason. Maybe there are family limitations. Maybe the school that a kid goes to doesn't provide those kind of opportunities, and so on. And a basic premise that I would like to go back to is essentially this. It is my submission that the relationship of adults with children, parents and children, teachers and students, is constructed on the basis of a culture of instruction, expectation, control, and obedience, and not on a culture of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And this is problematic. The reason I'm stating this is there is a difference between a processed experience and an unprocessed experience. If for purposes of parenting convenience, you sit a 2-year-old in front of the screen so that you can carry on with the rest of the stuff, and the kid is quiet and watching all that is unprocessed experience. It's just amorphous visual images and some sounds that the kid is not going to make any sense of. But I say that love is your willingness to engage with children in the culture of conversations and in activity. So you can allow a child to engage with the virtual and digital world. But let's talk about it and process it. Anything interesting that you did today, and if it's okay with you, can I do it along with you? And then convert it both into a processing of that experience into more abstractions and knowledge, but you're simultaneously also building a relationship which is based on respect and interest.
Absolutely.
Rather than on control, to say, listen, I think you're spending too much of time.
Yeah.
And, shouldn't you be doing better things? No, who decided what better things are?
Mm-hmm.
That's based on your assumption of, and those assumptions are not, they're not right or wrong or bad. I'm just saying they are conventional and they are traditional, and they are based on an intergenerational transfer of what we think is ideal or right for our children. But the world is changing, and parenting also has to adjust to those changes, and that's precisely the point that Kiran is making. And these things are only going to expand more. These innovations, artificial intelligence and chat GPT, all this is going to come into how they're going to do their assignments, and you can't wish it away.
Yeah.
But how do you still preserve the authenticity of original thought so that that's not sacrificed at the altar of innovation and technology? You cannot be a slave to, you should not be a slave to technology, but you should accept and use technology strategically to enhance the sense of aesthetics and the sense of your idea of the world, of nature, of relationships, of emotions, of articulation, of communication that is inherent in a child.
I can't agree more, Shekhar. And this is something that I really feel needs to be talked about. We don't examine ourselves as adults at all. When we have children, this whole idea of like how much time on a screen, But really, in our own behavior and basically our relationships with our children, we are not also doing the hard work it needs to develop interests in a child, because ultimately, who is going to do that? That for instance, if we don't have a relationship, say like he said, of conversation, you don't have a relationship where you explore different kinds of real world activities together, create opportunities for that. And I understand in many cultures, in many countries, in many classes, that's difficult to do. Especially in India, it's hard for a certain class of people to even have access to, you know sports or other kinds of the outdoors, things that you can do with kids, music, go to performances, take them to theater, things that you can explore with your children. Lots of us are completely, we are privileged enough to do it, and we still don't. And a child is not to know that these are also things that one can
Do.
partake of and uh, you know grow with. So you have people telling, parents telling children what not to do with their time, and they're like, just do something else, whatever it is. But there's no active sort of, and I would argue it begins from when a kid is much younger. You start doing that kind of stuff when a child is much younger. I've had so many friends who, because they're, working or whatever else, the child is plonked in front, like he said, of a screen, and food is shoveled into their mouths while they're watching a TV by a nanny. And that just destroys your relationship with food as well. So then food is just something that you consume to live, and you get over it, and you have particular things that you eat and things that you don't, because texturally you haven't really explored anything that doesn't, in your mind, all those things don't go off when you're eating, which is smell, texture, taste, it affects you overall. And then you have children who cannot, then beyond a point, it starts, you stop responding to things that are sort of possible in the real world. You're not interested in it because you haven't actually ever been exposed to it. You've never been for a walk. You and your friends have only always, sort of maybe engaged through a digital device. And that kind of, I feel like, is the danger. And I think it begins with adults and our own kind of, I don't know, I would like to say, like, investment of time in our children and in that
If you
relationship.
actually take a distance approach to this investment of time, um, Lev Vygotsky, he's a developmental psychologist, he spoke this about classrooms, but I think it applies equally to families. And he said that a classroom should be a collaborative community where knowledge is jointly constructed. So a family needs to be a collaborative community where knowledge is jointly constructed. Knowledge about people, about nature, about relationships, about emotions, about music, about theater, dance, and so on. And it sort of reminds me, if you really look at the whole debate on the digital world or the virtual world, and look at it from the lens of this thesis or idea, and if you were to ask yourself two questions. One is, what is the purpose of education, or what is the purpose of rearing a child? And for education, one may say that I believe the purpose of education is literacy, numeracy, livelihood, career development, and I have no issues with any of these ideas. But somebody once said, should the purpose of education really be about teaching children, about helping children learn how to learn? It's not about content, because the basic ability of a child to assimilate content and information is inbuilt. There is, of course, a Gaussian curve, and there are the outliers, but if you leave that aside for the time being. But may I dare say that the purpose of education and the purpose of parenting is the development of an egalitarian personhood, and the development of a socially responsive and responsible citizen, and the development of an identity that is imbued with aesthetic sensibility, like I said, about nature, about relationships, about emotions, about music, art, and so on. So that in the whole context and interaction of a parent with the child within the digital uh, frame of reference, and you're looking at this child 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line, and if you were to ask any kid or any adult, what do you remember about your childhood? You'll remember that which is a stable memory. And a stable memory is something that either happened very often or it happened once, but it was so joyous or so horrible that you simply cannot forget it. So there are stories that we construct about childhood and parenting, and I will bring in the digital thesis into it in a bit. You know what I remember about my childhood? I remember that in my home, I had we had a 100-year-old bell, and it was my job during meal times to actually ring the bell, and the whole extended family would gather, and we would eat and talk and marvel at the food that grandma had conjured. You know, the smells and the textures that you speak about, and that special meal that was produced once a week. And now, at the age of 45, that bell has pride of place in my house. You know what I remember about my childhood? I remember every day thinking, why the heck was I born in this family? All I remember about my childhood is night after night putting my ear outside my parents' door to listen whether they were killing each other or not. Now you add the digital reality and the conundrum to this narrative, and you look at what stories they will construct 5 years, 10 years, 25 years down the line to reconstruct their childhoods. So the point I'm really making is, how do we build narratives and meta narratives about their engagement with the digital world, therefore, to create a childhood which is vibrant, rich, joyous, and processed, that then builds into their egalitarian personhood and aesthetic identity, and someone who has a sense of the very divisive social worlds that we live in, to build adults who are alert and empathic to the huge schisms that exist. This is not to say that everybody has to be an activist. That's not what I'm saying. But to have a sense of how you lead your lives, uh, embracing the digital world and using it to your advantage for purposes of day-to-day sustenance and living, but yet not at the expense of the many subtle and emotional, emotive abstractions that actually constitute what life is all about. So that's the kind of frame of reference that I've really used to nuance the kind of engagement that we can have with children in the context of the increasingly digitization of the world.
Okay, super excited, because what I'm sort of getting is that when we can engage in conversation and use the tool of the digital world and everything that it brings to engage in creativity and curiosity and play and pleasure, we can sort of find a helpful way to integrate it into our lives, because it's there. There's not much we can do about it not being there. But now, how can we make meaning out of this? And how to find that line between obsessive, I'm doom scrolling, I'm just constantly watching a screen, versus I may be watching a screen, but it could still be engaging and meaningful. Because what I think is most important is this framework, then with anecdotes and specifics, really helps someone listening to create their own frame of reference, to then apply it in their own lives and figure out how to navigate it for themselves, irrespective of access to resources and things like that, right? Because once I have a framework and then I understand some of the specifics, I can then recalibrate to what my needs are, what my access and abilities are. Great. Thank you so much. So one thing that I like to end on every episode is at Agatsu, we have something called emotional hygiene. And it's basically a way of saying, are there little things that we can build into our day-to-day life that we do irrespective of whether we're feeling good or not good? And they're just things that I would say are practices that you do that help with your emotional well-being. And one of the things that is part of emotional hygiene is noticing the little things. So what I'd like for us to do is I'll give each of us clipboards and we have to write one not negative thing that has happened up to this point today.
Okay.
So everybody loves their mom and everybody's grateful for their mom.
Okay.
Great. But today, like, what are the small things that are either interesting, curious, odd, fun, anything, so that we sort of start to intentionally focus on things other than the bad.
Okay.
Yeah? Oh man, I have to start thinking of these as well.
You mean like the butter almond croissant?
Yeah. So much you wrote.
Yeah. I had to explain.
PhD thesis लिख रहे हो क्या?
Okay, do you want to go first?
My blue bangles and my French braid, and then I remembered Shekhar's beard, so also Shekhar's beard.
Mine is one of my friends turned 50 today. So we had a celebratory coffee and chocolate tart over breakfast. So I'm happy that I have friends and coffee and chocolate.
A warm butter almond croissant and a warmer studio atmosphere make for the flow of thought processes ... in the hope of transformation.
Oh, thank you so much, Shekhar. Thanks, guys.
Pleasure.
The end. Thank you for watching The Curious Case Off with me. In the description below, there will be links, further reading, summaries, guidelines, resources, everything that we could find and put together that we think you might find helpful. Just to reiterate that everything that is said in the episode as well as in the resources below should not be used to self-diagnose. If you have any questions or queries, please reach out to a mental health professional who is qualified. And if you like the episode, then like, share and subscribe to Agatsu Foundation, our YouTube channel. And if you want to know anything more about the organization, then you can find out at www.agatsufoundation.org.